"Who are these miserable persons?" said the great goblin.
"Dwarves, and this,"
said one of the drivers, pulling at Bilbo's chain so that he fell forward onto his knees.
"We found them sheltering in our front porch."
"What do you mean by it?" said the great goblin, turning to Thorin. "Up to no good, I'll warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of elves, not unlikely. Come, what have ye got to say?" "Thorin the dwarf at your service," he replied. It was merely a polite nothing. "Of the things which you suspect and imagine, we have no idea at all. We sheltered from a storm in what seemed a convenient cave and unused. Nothing was further from our thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in any way whatever." That was true enough. Said the great goblin. "So you say. Might I ask what you were doing up in the mountains at all, and where you were coming from, and where you were going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good, Thorin Oakenshield. I know too much about your folk already. But let's have the truth, or I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you." "We were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces, and first, second, and third cousins, and the other descendants of our grandfathers, who live on the east side of these truly hospitable mountains," said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say all at once in a moment, when obviously the exact truth would not do at all.
"He is a liar, O truly tremendous one," said one of the drivers. "Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below, and they were as dead as stones. Also, he has not explained this."
He held out the sword which Thorin had worn, the sword which came from the troll's lair. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. They had called it Orcrist, Goblin Cleaver, but the goblins called it simply Biter. They hated it, and hated worse anyone that carried it. "Murderers and elf friends," the great goblin shouted. "Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them. Take them away to dark holes full of snakes, and never let them see the light again." He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and himself rushed at Thorin with his mouth open. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went off poof into a tower of blue glowing smoke, right up to the roof, that scattered piercing white sparks all among the goblins. "You think you've found somebody, so suddenly my program gets the axe?" "It's not about this kid that Graf found. It's about the low quality of what you've been finding. We knew it was long odds, but the kids I'm working with are actually fighting a war just to stay alive. Your kids are so malnourished that they suffer serious mental degradation before you even begin testing them. Most of them haven't formed any normal human bonds. They're so messed up they can't get through a day without finding something they could steal, break, or disrupt. They also represent possibility, as all children do." "That's just the kind of sentimentality that discredits your whole project in the eyes of the IF." Poke kept her eyes open all the time. The younger children were supposed to be on watch too, and sometimes they could be quite observant, but they just didn't notice all the things they needed to notice, and that meant that Poke could only depend on herself to see danger. There was plenty of danger to watch for. The cops, for instance. They didn't show up often, but when they did, they seemed especially bent on clearing the streets of children. They would flail about them with their magnetic whips, landing cruel stinging blows on even the smallest children, haranguing them as vermin, thieves, pestilence, a plague on the fair city of Rotterdam. It was Poke's job to notice when a disturbance in the distance suggested that the cops might be running a sweep.
Then she would give the alarm whistle, and the little ones would rush to their hiding places till the danger was past. But the cops didn't come by that often. The real danger was much more immediate. Big kids. Poke, at age 9, was the matriarch of her little crew. Not that any of them knew for sure that she was a girl, but that cut no ice with the 11 and 12 and 13-year-old boys and girls who bullied their way around the streets. The adult-sized beggars and thieves and whores of the street paid no attention to the little kids except to kick them out of the way. But the older children who were among the kicked turned around and preyed on the younger ones. Anytime Poke's crew found something to eat, especially if they located a dependable source of garbage or an easy mark for a coin or a bit of food, they had to watch jealously and hide their winnings, for the bullies liked nothing better than to take away whatever scraps of food the little ones might have. Stealing from younger children was much safer than stealing from shops or passers-by, and they enjoyed it. Poke could see that. They liked how the little kids cowered and obeyed and whimpered and gave them whatever they demanded. "I'll never remember this," Ron burst out one afternoon, throwing down his quill and looking longingly out of the library window. It was the first really fine day they'd had in months. The sky was a clear forget-me-not blue, and there was a feeling in the air of summer coming. Harry, who was looking up Dittany in 1000 Magical Herbs and Fungi, didn't look up until he heard Ron say, "Hagrid, what are you doing in the library?" Hagrid shuffled into view, hiding something behind his back. He looked very out of place in his moleskin overcoat. "Just looking," he said in a shifty voice that got their interest at once. "And what are you lot up to?" He looked suddenly suspicious. "You're not still looking for Nicholas Flamel, are ya?" "Oh, we found out who he is ages ago," said Ron impressively. "And we know what that dog's guarding. It's the Sorcerer Shh!" Hagrid looked around quickly to see if anyone was listening. "Don't go shouting about it. What's the matter with ya?" "There are a few things we wanted to ask you, as a matter of fact," said Harry, "about what's guarding the stone apart from Fluffy." "Shh!" said Hagrid again. "Listen, come and see me later. I'm not promising I'll tell you anything, mind, but don't go rabbiting about it in here. Students aren't supposed to know. They'll think I've told you." "See you later, then," said Harry. Hagrid shuffled off. "What was he hiding behind his back?" said Hermione thoughtfully. "Do you think it had anything to do with the stone?" "I'm going to see what section he was in," said Ron, who'd had enough of working. He came back a minute later with a pile of books in his arms and slammed them down on the table. "Dragons," he whispered. "Hagrid was looking up stuff about dragons. Look at these. Dragon species of Great Britain and Ireland. From Egg to Inferno, a dragon keeper's guide. Hagrid's always wanted a dragon. He told me so the first time I ever met him," said Harry. "But it's against our laws," said Ron. "Dragon breeding was outlawed by the Warlocks Convention of 1709. Everyone knows that. It's hard to stop muggles from noticing us if we're keeping dragons in the back garden. Anyway, you can't tame dragons. It's dangerous. You should see the burns Charlie's got off wild ones in Romania." "But there aren't wild dragons in Britain," said Harry. "Of course there are," said Ron. "Common Welsh green and Hebridean blacks. The Ministry of Magic has a job hushing them up, I can tell you. Our kind have to keep putting spells on muggles who've spotted them, to make them forget." "So what on earth's Hagrid up to?" said Hermione. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. "And what is the use of a book," thought Alice, "without pictures or conversations?" So she was considering in her own mind, as well as she could, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain would be worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. There was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be too late." When she thought it over afterwards, it occurred to her that she ought to have wondered at this, but at the time it all seemed quite natural.
But when the rabbit actually took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it and then hurried on, Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it, and, burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it, and was just in time to see it pop down a large rabbit hole under the hedge. In another moment, down went Alice after it, never once considering how in the world she was to get out again. The rabbit hole went straight on like a tunnel for some way, and then dipped suddenly down, so suddenly that Alice had not a moment to think about stopping herself before she found herself falling down what seemed to be a very deep well. Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time as she went down to look about her, and to wonder what was going to happen next. First she tried to look down and make out what she was coming to, but it was too dark to see anything. Then she looked at the sides of the well, and noticed that they were filled with cupboards and bookshelves. Here and there she saw maps and pictures hung upon pegs. She took down a jar from one of the shelves as she passed. It was labelled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment, it was empty. She did not like to drop the jar for fear of killing somebody underneath, so managed to put it into one of the cupboards as she fell past it. Well, thought Alice to herself, after such a fall as this, I shall think nothing of tumbling downstairs. How brave they'll all think of me at home. Why, I wouldn't say anything about it, even if I fell off the top of the house, which was very likely true.
No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. Dr. John Montague was a doctor of philosophy. He had taken his degree in anthropology, feeling obscurely that in this field he might come closest to his true vocation, the analysis of supernatural manifestations. He was scrupulous about the use of his title because, his investigations being so utterly unscientific, he hoped to borrow an air of respectability, even scholarly authority, from his education. It had cost him a good deal in money and pride, since he was not a begging man, to rent Hill House for 3 months, but he expected absolutely to be compensated for his pains by the sensation following upon the publication of his definitive work on the causes and effects of psychic disturbances in a house commonly known as haunted. He had been looking for an honestly haunted house all his life. When he heard of Hill House, he had been at first doubtful, then hopeful, then indefatigable. He was not the man to let go of Hill House once he had found it. I woke up to find her sobbing softly, her slender body trembling under the covers. I turned on the heater and checked the clock. 2 a.m. A startlingly white moon shone in the middle of the sky. I waited for her to stop crying before putting the kettle on for tea. 1 tea bag for the both of us. No sugar, no lemon, just plain hot tea. Then lighting up 2 cigarettes, I handed one to her. She inhaled and spat out the smoke, 3 times in rapid succession, before she broke down coughing. "Tell me, have you ever thought of killing me?" she asked. "You?" "Yeah." "Why are you asking me such a thing?" Her cigarette still at her lips, she rubbed her eyelid with a fingertip. "No special reason." "No, never," I said. "Honest?" "Honest. Why would I want to kill you?" "Oh, I guess you're right," she said. "I thought for a second there that maybe it wouldn't be so bad to get murdered by someone, like when I'm sound asleep." "I'm afraid I'm not the killer type." "Oh?" "As far as I know." She laughed. She put her cigarette out, drank down the rest of her tea, then lit up again. "I'm going to live to be 25, she said, "then die." July, 8 years later, she was dead at 26.
Traditionally, the fencing halls of Japan, called dojo, were associated with shrines and temples, but during Musashi's lifetime, numerous schools sprang up in the new castle towns. Each daimyo, or lord, sponsored a kendo school, where his retainers could be trained and his sons educated. The hope of every ronin was that he would defeat the students and master of a dojo in combat, thus increasing his fame and bringing his name to the ears of one who might employ him. The samurai wore 2 swords thrust through the belt with the cutting edge uppermost. The longer sword was carried out of doors only. The shorter sword was worn at all times. For training, wooden swords and bamboo swords were often used. Dueling and other tests of arms were common, with both real and practice swords. These took place in fencing halls and before shrines, in the streets and within castle walls. Duels were fought to the death, or until one of the contestants was disabled. But a few generations after Musashi's time, the shinai, a pliable bamboo sword, and later padded fencing armor came to be widely used, so the chances of injury were greatly reduced. The samurai studied with all kinds of weapons: halberds, sticks, swords, chain and sickle, and others. Many schools using such weapons survive in traditional form in Japan today. To train in kendo, one must subjugate the self, bear the pain of grueling practice, and cultivate a level mind in the face of peril. But the way of the sword means not only fencing training, but also living by the code of honor of the samurai elite. Warfare was the spirit of the samurai's everyday life, and he could face death as if it were a domestic routine. The meaning of life and death by the sword was mirrored in the everyday conduct of the feudal Japanese, and he who realized the resolute acceptance of death at any moment in his everyday life was a master of the sword. It is in order to attain such an understanding that later men have followed the ancient traditions of the sword fencing styles, and even today give up their lives for kendo practice.
Presently my soul grew stronger. Hesitating then no longer, "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, 'Lenore?' This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, 'Lenore.' Merely this and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. 'Surely,' said I, 'surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more.' Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. 'Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou,' I said, 'art shown no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore.' Quoth the raven, 'Nevermore.'